Hello, welcome to DynamicsCon and to the specific session of All Your Plugin Base Are Belong to Us. I'm your speaker, Daryl Labar. I'm a 5-time Microsoft MVP from Indianapolis, Indiana. I'll let you lead through the rest of those bullet points if you'd like. President of Gap Integrity, and doing this for a long time, and glad that you're here, and hopefully this is beneficial for you. If you have any questions during the session, please put them in the comments. I'll respond to those since this is a virtual session, but I'll be in the chat. Whatever questions you have, I'll be trying to answer those things. So that's the quick housekeeping guide, but let's go ahead and actually get looking at the agenda for today. So the title's kind of funny, all our plugin base are belong to us. It comes from a Nintendo meme from back in the day, but really this is just about your plugin base class for Dynamics for Dataverse plugins. And it's about all the best and maybe not so best practices that come with that. So we'll look at some common pitfalls, boilerplate we probably would look to remove from your plugin. How do you prevent infinite loops? Things you want to log, things you want to trace. And then there's a couple of specific projects that I have that are open source that you're welcome to use that implement all these things. And as well as stepping into even what it looks like to do some early bound plugin development with actions, which is something that is not always, I haven't seen that used a lot, and it's really powerful. I want to make sure everyone is aware of that. So getting started, some common pitfalls. Class level variables. This is something that I've seen, over, all my years of working as a contractor, of seeing this when I come into a client. I'm like, oh, this is bad. And people don't see it, and it's easy not to see it as being an issue. But the issue is right here that we've got a class level variable in our plugin. That class level variable now, because it's getting set here in the execute, now runs into some race conditions. The plugin that will get created once, class will, so you have an instance of that, and then it'll get called multiple times asynchronously or multi-threaded actually. And so in that case, you could have one plugin running, not finished yet in your execute, when another plugin comes and it overrides or oversteps your iOrization service or whatever this actual property is. So you want to make sure that you're not doing the class level variables. If you absolutely have to do a class level variable for your plugin, what you're going to end up having to do is create another instance of a plugin within your execute. That way it's scoped just to that single thread that's executing, and then you can have some class level variables. But if you have the standard plugin or just your plugin, you have your execute method and it's called, you want to eliminate any class level variables that are not initialized in the constructor. So if you're getting the actual config data, the secure config or unsecure config, that's A-OK because that's done in the constructor and it's done once. Just don't be updating it outside of that constructor and you should be good to go. So class level variables, number one thing I see for people that are new to writing plugins and things that will get you in trouble because it does lead to that race condition. So next, putting everything in the execute. This is more or less, for some reason, I think a lot of developers just kind of forget about some good programming practices here, and they'll create one giant method that has everything in it and is extremely difficult to A, debug, and B, to follow, and C, to extend. So this is an example here. You can't see very well because it's so big and shrunk down, but this is a previous client that had one execute method for the plugin. So we're 500 lines long, had multiple nested regions within the function itself. And there were 37 separate calls to CRM through the iOrization service of the plugin, and one null ref somewhere in that plugin. I had no idea where it was until I went through and started breaking it down and dividing it into smaller methods and then rewriting the plugin and actually seeing what method was actually getting the null ref, and I could file a stack trace and handle it from there. But by default, it just was not really maintainable. So make sure, don't do this. Don't be the kid that does this. Go through and divide your execute into smaller methods and divide it up. It helps immensely with readability, and if there is an error, knowing what part of the code actually is generating that error. Because in this instance, I had no idea where that error was until I actually did some refactoring on it. So don't do that. Another thing here, remove your boilerplate code here. So the stuff that's always there, don't be doing that. Use a plugin base. Don't be just having a generic plugin. So these are examples I see all the time. You got plugin 1, plugin 2, plugin 3, plugin 4. There's no base class, and you're using these same 4 lines of code copy and pasted in every single plugin. Getting your tracing service, getting your context, getting your service factory, getting your organization service. You'll see this in the SDK, in the documentation, because it makes sense for it to be there because you don't know anything otherwise and you need to get to those. But be smart about things and pull that out into something that actually does that for you. And we'll get into that in a little bit later about what I recommend. But for this case, look to eliminate that boilerplate where at all possible. Another thing I see is defaulting the system service, but not knowing what it actually is. So here I'm setting a system service, but I never actually define, is it the default user or is it the system user service or what is this get organization service method? So be sure that it's explicit about what you're doing or know that what you're doing when you're pulling it out. Is this the actual system organization service or is this an actual organization service that's specific for the user or the initiating user? Just make sure that's evident and called out if you are moving your code from this boilerplate stuff into another method to actually go get your organization service. Diving into this boilerplate code, this is really where you want to let that plugin base handle a lot of the code for you. Here we have an example of a plugin method we have, context example, and it implements iPlugin and inherits from plugin base. One thing to note, you may have your Visual Studio tell you don't need to have iPlugin on your class itself, and you may not, unless your plugin base or somewhere in your plugin base you have a generic type, generic class. If you do have a generic class, the actual server itself will not find your plugin, and you will need to make sure you put the iPlugin on the actual top level plugin class that you're working with. So just calling that out. But here we see that we have a override here. So it's a typed context. So we're giving this extended plugin context that has already gone through and done all the work of getting our system organization service, our context, our tracing service, and our plugin context has already been pulled and pushed into this extended plugin context. And now we just need to override it and we can use whatever we need to use out of it. So that's one place there. It is, do you want to make that kind of a lazy loaded thing too? So it's not going and creating a system organization service and creating one that's the user specific organization service. And it's creating this other one. You want to make sure that that's lazily loaded if you can help that as well. Also, a quick point here. You also want to probably be using the most or least secure or the most restrictive organization service by default. So that's why in my context or my extended plugin context, the organization service is the user service. So this is going to be the user to actually trigger the plugin it's running as. And then when you need to do something that's actually going to require system level settings, that's when we'd actually use this system organization service to do that. So yeah, just make sure that you're doing that and create that pit of success. So by default, developers are probably going to hit the organization service, and then when they realize they need more credentials, more settings, more power, then they can switch over to system organization service. I hardly ever use the initiating user organization service, but I do include it at least in my extended plugin context as well. I think that's also interesting is why do we have all these extra things floating around? There's no reason that your extended plugin context here can't also implement your iTracing service in your iPlugin execution context. So that way you don't have to pass in a tracing service as well with their context. Context has everything in it, and you can immediately do context.trace without having to go context.tracing service.trace. It just is already implemented. It's already there, ready to go. So things that I definitely recommend doing, just remove a lot of that boilerplate and make your code much less. So the less code you write, usually the less bugs you're going to have. So pretty good correlation there. So give that a shot. Try catching. I have seen plenty of cases where there's about 10 times more try catching there actually needs to be. If you can put your try catch in your plugin base class, then you only really need to handle catching it and handling that error once. Now you could handle try catches if there is additional information you need to add to your error exception hierarchy information. But for the most part, you usually don't need that. You've got one error, it's a null ref, you can let it float up. You don't need to be catching it at 15 different spots and logging at 15 different spots. Log it at the very, very top level plugin base, and everything will go smooth at that point in time. So here you can see an example where the create plugin context creates this custom context here. And then using this using statement, it will actually use the iDisposable to start and stop your timer. So here, by calling this trace time, that will do the start statement here. So you see this start timer with the whatever that method happens to be, whatever that name has to be in there. And then when it hits the closing bracket here, that's when you'll actually have the timer end there. So kind of a neat little feature. You can use it if you want, but it really helps if you have something that you have no idea how long it takes. It makes it really easy to call out that you're tracing this thing explicitly. And here down here, we actually handle all exceptions. All exceptions for all the plugins are handled at this actual base execute method, which makes sense to have it happen in one spot. And then also here, this is kind of something that's you don't always hit, but you can, and that's having custom exceptions. So lots of times, or originally when I was working with plugins, I may create a custom exception and think, great, I've got a custom exception. Or maybe I'm referencing a third party and I'm IL merging it in there, and they have a custom exception that gets thrown. And I need to be a good developer here, a good plugin developer, and wrap it in the plugin execution concept error handling, right? And even if you take that plugin and you put it underneath of it as the parent plugin, that still will not work. It'll get a serialization error, and it'll actually blow chow on that and not where your actual error is. So you kind of have to be aware of that. That's why there's this if execute exception error handling stuff that will go through, check the exception, check the hierarchy of the exception, and make sure that it's all going to be within the actual .NET framework, or an error within the SDK. And if it's in those two camps, it'll be fine, and you can throw it just fine without any issues. Otherwise, you won't actually get the exception. You'll get an error serializing the exception, which doesn't help you as far as what your exception is about. So little lesson learned there for me. Access, target, image, and final value. So this is stuff that makes sense in quite a different situations. What I mean by this is you want to be able to get your target out as quickly and easily as possible. So this SDK way is what you'll see a lot of times. Context input parameters of target to entity of type contact to get your actual contact target out of your context. Here, context.getTarget is much simpler, way easier. You just say, hey, get the target and get the actual entity type here. And now you have a typed target already given to you. So way less code to write, way less ways to have, maybe you don't spell target correctly and all that kind of fun stuff. So this is way easier to read than this weird line here. So, put that into your plugin context. Pre-image. That's another kind of fun one where getting the pre-entity can be simplified immensely, as well as trying to get the actual first value or the actual value from your pre-image as well. So let's say, or the SDK way of doing this is to say, all right, you got to get the target, and then you got to see if the target contains that property you're looking for, in this case, first name. And if it contains it, great, go and return it, else return from the image. So this is going to happen like a pre-operation where you're trying to see, hey, what is the actual value of the first name? And you got to check to see maybe the user updated it or whatever. So this is like getting the final value. This is really, really annoying to go through and do that. So I create a coalesce target with pre-entity method here that goes through and says, all right, I'm going to take my target and I'm going to take my pre-entity and I'm going to coalesce them. So that way anything the target has is going to override what's in the pre-image. So that way, whatever the latest and greatest will be in this coalesced entity. And then I just know, oh, this is the first thing, whether it came from the pre-image or from the target, I don't care. I just know this is going to be the most recent value based on both that target and that pre-image. And so now from here on out, I can use the single entity early bound and get whatever properties that I need without having any issues with this, with all this mumbo jumbo of every single time I need an entity doing contains, and if it contains it, returning the first value and all that kind of fun stuff. So highly, highly recommend doing some sort of coalescing there. This was kind of a fun one. Doesn't work in all the cases, but infinite loops. I'm sure that me, like many people, have used infinite loops before. So in this case, you don't want to use infinite loops, right? You want to prevent them. So you can actually use the shared variables to prevent probably about 80% infinite loops. Those are loops, the most simplest one, where you're doing an update that triggers an update of the same entity that then triggers an update, that sort of infinite loop. This will actually prevent that one. And all it's doing is well, if it's a delete, we know we don't have to worry about that because we can't call delete in the same entity. So that's good. But otherwise, it's going to go through and create this key here based on all these different properties of the context, the type name, the message name, all that kind of fun stuff. It's going to join those all together to create a key, and then it's going to check to see, hey, has this already existed? Has this plugin already ran based on that key, based on the plugin type, the message name, the stage, the primary entity ID, takes all those things, and then checks to see if it's there. If it's there, great, returns true and says, hey, I'm not going to execute, and I'm going to prevent this recursive call. If it's not there, it adds it and returns false, saying, oh, no, we didn't have to prevent the recursive call, and it keeps on executing. So you can put this in your base class of your base plugin, and every single plugin inherits from it. It's great. One thing to kind of call out here is get first shared variable. The context can be nested of the parent context. And so this just walks through the parent context to find the first instance of this property in the context. So it's just a little quick way to put it in one single extension method rather than having to go through and do it for every single, have a loop in there to go through all the potential parent contexts. So logging. This is probably something that's the most helpful for people, especially people that do not use unit testing for their plugins. If you're not using Fake XRM Easy or my XRM unit test framework, this is very, very helpful. It's also not easy. So I kind of recommend you to use my stuff, way easier. But if you want to, you look at what I've written in my daily beta XRM library, you can go ahead and check that out. I'll post where that is at the end of this slide deck here. But just be careful of trying to do this by yourself because it's not very easy. So by default, what you do is you just wrap the I-organization service, the real one, with your own version of it that does pass-through calls to the real one. But before it passes it through, it just does the actual logging. And it should be able to conditionally log it, or at least mine does. And it logs the duration. If it's a retrieve multiple, does it as a fetch or the query expression? It gives you what that actual value is. The query expression is actually the SQL equivalent, which is super helpful when you're going through and getting maybe a null ref error and it's traced out, oh, it did this one query and oh, I got a null ref error. You can rerun that query locally and go, oh, all right, this is why it returned 0 results, or this is why this record didn't have the attribute I was looking for. That's why we have our null ref. So that's retrieve, create, retrieve, and update, give you just the name, the ID, just simple things like that. So that just goes through and just automatically wraps that service and automatically logs that for you. So all you need to do is initiate it by wrapping, the normal factory create organization service. You map it with your own little extended organization service and pass in that tracing service. And then there's some service settings to configure. Do you actually want to log it, or how do you want to log it, or all that kind of fun stuff. So here's some examples. So here's an update expression. So you can say, hey, starting timer for execute requests. So that's from the when you're actually doing this retrieve multiple. And then it's a query expression. It gives you the actual select statement. So this is going to give you all the account columns from the account, where the account primary contact ID is this GUID, and gives you how long it took. So this is an actual query from a unit test that I wrote. So that would take 0.002 seconds for the unit test when I'm running locally. But again, against the server, that should take a lot longer. And oh, look at this. I've got a star here. That's bad for performance reasons. I need to give all the individual properties I actually want, or all the individual columns I actually want to retrieve. So not only is it helpful for that, it's helpful for those kind of edge cases that, oh, I forgot to do that filter there. Logging organization service requests for the retrieve multiple. So here's an example of, actually this is an update request, where, hey, here are the values that we're actually setting. We're setting this value, we're nulling out these values, and we're setting that value. Boom, here's my entity. Executing code. You can do this 500 different ways. I've seen some people that have one giant plugin that then will call, or they have one main method that then will call 4 or 5 other sub methods from it. That usually involves like a switch statement or if statement, depending on if it's a create or an update or the pre-execution or post-execution. So what I like to do is to have it be declarative as far as what you're going to do here. This each plugin will implement this create events method that will actually give back the, hey, these are the events that this plugin actually operates on. And it gives the pre-operation. So this, for example, is a pre-operation of create and update. For these entities, execute this method, execute CRM phone number. Pre-operation and create and update of these entities, go ahead and execute the CRM address. So I don't have any if statements, I don't have any switch statements. It's all declarative at the very top of my plugin class. And that way any future plugin developers that come and look at my code go, where does this code execute? How does this code execute for these entities or for these messages? And see, oh, okay, for both create and updates and the pre-operation, it does this. for these entities, and for these entities, it does that. And now, oh, okay, there's two different methods that will get called depending on the context. I mentioned earlier about, not always tracing information. Here's a way that I do that a lot, because you can easily hit the limit of how much tracing you have in a plugin. And so sometimes you may want to turn off the tracing, or sometimes you may want to turn on the tracing, especially when you're in prod. You don't normally trace, but hey, I want to incur the cost of going through and serializing all of my entities and all my attributes in my plugin to the trace log so I can see what's going on. And that's as simple as going through and utilizing the secure config. I'll give you a sec to try to think about, why would I use the secure config rather than the unsecure config? There's your second. Okay, so hopefully you came up with the idea I did, that if I use the unsecure config and I'm tracing in dev or QA, I could potentially move that up the chain to another environment. If I use a secure config, that's only going to be for that environment, and I don't have to worry about potentially moving up the chain if I want to or not. So the whole idea here is that I provide a pre-context, post-context, and pre-post context sort of message here of trace context that will trace out what is the context before the plugin started and what is the context after the plugin finished. And that way you can see what values have changed, what values haven't changed, and be able to kind of debug to see what's going on. So very, very helpful, be able to turn the on and off basically at will. So the way this is implemented is just says, hey, if pre-context is traced, and that's this little method that says, hey, if this contains any, ignoring the case of the secure config, if it contains any of these values, and then this is this method that just goes through and checks to see if any of those values are in this secure config. If it is, great. Then it will actually say true, it's being traced, and it'll go ahead and trace out the context. That gives you all the information in the context. So here's some examples. So you'll see the plugin, you'll see the registered event, stage, message, and the logical name, what the execute name actually is, if there is an execute method to call there, business unit correlation, owner ID, mode, stage, primary entity ID, primary entity name, all that kind of fun stuff. And this stuff is usually very helpful when you're debugging, to be able to go, oh yeah, this is the exact record that I'm dealing with, and then you can go look at the record to see why would have failed this particular plugin. Input parameters are very helpful, especially the target and getting in, what was the information that came in. Maybe there's a value that is null and you forgot to add it to your pre-image, and so that's why you're having an issue. Those are all very helpful. So those input parameters. Output parameters are also output post-entity images as well. So if there's a pre-entity image, you'll see all those things in there. Oh, maybe I forgot to include an additional column to my pre-image. And then finally a shared variable. So here you'll see this is the key that gets generated by the plugin itself whenever it's running. And you go, oh, okay, this thing this previous plugin has already ran in the pipeline, and that can help as well for troubleshooting. If all this stuff sounds like stuff you want to have, or stuff you want to need, or stuff you want to utilize, you don't have to do it yourself, although you could, and I tried to explain how I do it, or how it works. But it's already available for you. You can already do it. It's out here on GitHub. There's an example project that's in my XRM unit test project, but github.com/Daryl Labar/XRM unit test.example. It's just an example project. Or if you prefer, you can also use the Visual Studio Solution Accelerator, which is in the XRM toolbox. And that will just go ahead and runs a little wizard, and it will input or import into your project a plugin base and a plugin class with all the code structure. Because the code structure is a little bit complicated, and I'll walk through it here just to see what it is. But here is the code structure from that GitHub project. Right now, if you haven't seen these two diamond icon for a project, don't be afraid. It happens a lot. This is just a shared project. So think of back in the day when we were in SourceSafe, or I was in SourceSafe, they had shared files. And so you'd individually say, hey, this file is here, and it's also here, and it's also here, and it's also here. And if you had 500 files, each file had to be individually shared at different locations. And that was kind of annoying to deal with at the very least. A shared project basically says, hey, Visual Studio, this is a Visual Studio thing, not a source control issue. Visual Studio, take whatever is in here and pretend like it lives wherever it's being referenced. So in this case, the plugin references this logic, and so it all lives in here, and it's not IL merged. So if you want to be 100% supported without using IL merge, then this is a great way to share code and have the same plugin class for every single one of your plugin assemblies. So that shared core will contain your early bound entities, your plugin base code, any other shared plugin code you want to use, and also define, your specific context and your plugin base classes. All that stuff could be in that shared base, shared project, and then used within multiple actual C# plugin projects. So in each plugin project, we'll reference the shared project, and then I also have references to NuGet source-only packages. So it's kind of weird that I'm doing two different things here. I'm doing both shared assemblies as well as source-only NuGet packages. And the reason is this is totally your project, your code, your stuff. Generally, by default, this is all very, very simple. It generally kind of inherits from here, and then here you can extend it and do whatever you want, and I just won't break you. I can do whatever changes I need to in here. But this then allows me also to not require you to reference a DLL and run into an issue with IL merging or anything like that. So that's why these things get brought in. If you aren't using workflows, you don't need to reference the workflow source-only package. But that's how that's all set up. So now these are all the base classes that are used to implement all the logic and the features that I showed. But then these are the actual classes that you can use on top of that then you can extend and do whatever you want to with it. So that way you can have your own plugin base class that's used however you want to use it and add whatever features you want to use it. Maybe you want to add some sort of default JSON serialization to it or something like that. You can do that in here and not have to worry about touching my stuff here. So that's just a simple way for doing that. And again, other great part, there's no references to this besides normal.NET SDK DLLs as well as the Microsoft SDK for Microsoft XRM. So yeah, so that's the project structure. The extended plugin context. So this would be my particular plugin context base. And then this would be basically what you would actually create. You'd create this extended plugin context, which was right here, if you can see that. And this is all the code that exists. It's just the single constructor that passes the iService provider and iRegistered events plugin into the base class. That's it. Okay, so this is the actual extended plugin context. Then the generic plugin base class, trying not to dive too low into here, but this is something else you need to create, which basically says, all right, I'm going to inherit from my stuff here, and it's going to specify what is my actual plugin context. So you've got your own plugin context, and you may have more. You may have a hierarchy of plugin context. I'll get into that a little bit later. But generally, all you need to do is set this up as generic, and again, set up the constructor to pass the unsecure and secure config information down to the base class. And then in your plugin base class, you want to make sure you inherit from the generic plugin. So it says, all right, this is the extended plugin context, is the context that I'm going to be using. And that's the method you need to override in your execute is, hey, this is the plugin context that gets passed in. And you just need to provide a method that creates it. So create plugin context, new, blah, that's it. Again, pretty simple, very, very small bit of code to add. So I will dive in a little bit more since I have time here to look at the early bound action plugins. There's a good quote from a good friend of mine, Jonas Rapp. You can have too much of a good thing, except when it comes to early binding, which is a lie. Jonas doesn't do early binding; he does late. But I thought it'd be kind of funny. So I love early binding, and it makes life even easier when you're doing custom actions or custom API plugin development. Don't get too afraid. This is a little complicated, but hopefully I'll be able to explain it in a way you understand here. So in this, I have an action context, which is going to be for my action. So think we have the extended plugin context. And so now I have an action context, which all it defines is the type of the request and type of the response. Okay. So when you actually use the early bound generator, you can specify actions or custom APIs that you want to generate early bound typing for. And so all you need to do is generate the early bound typing and then create your own action class based on that. And then utilize those when you're actually using your action context. Everything else here is pretty much the same, except down here, it's going to take the input parameters and suck those into the request type object and the response output parameters into the response type object. And I'll show you how you use that in just a second here. So, so that's the context. And then we have the action plugin base, which is what you're going to actually inherit from your action plugins or your custom API plugins. They're both the same thing in the backend pretty much at this point. So in here, once again, you're inheriting from the generic plugin base. And here you've got your types for the request and response. Nothing too tricky here. And that type request response here is the action context that you'll be returning. So based on the type of the request and the response of the plugin, that's the same request and response to the action context. So that's just saying, all right, I'm going to create a new action context of this type and that type. So you could, if you wanted to, like create a new instance of that action context that was specific to the request and the response types, but you don't have to, and it works fairly well without doing it. Here's an example. So this is a theoretical void payment action. Let's say you send in some information and it does some logic to figure out maybe it should void the payment or not void the payment. And if it voids the payment, it says true, hey, it's voiding the payment, and it gives a message. So this is my plugin. I have inherited from the action plugin base. I have given my early bounded request and response types. I got request and response. Then I override my execute method here. So override void execute internal. And I say, all right, this is of this specific type. And this is already going to be typed automatically because of how this plugin base is created. So if you just type this line and say, hey, Visual Studio, implement the method, it's going to automatically create this for you, this context. And then you can fill in this part. Hey, if the context.request.amount is greater than 100, so this is the actual amount property that you define in your custom action or your custom API. And if it's greater than 100, then hey, payment voided, it goes true, and the message amounts too long or too large, and you return. So here I'm using both the request and the response, all early bound. I don't have to worry about getting the names correct or the capitalization correct or whatever for the input and output parameters. Everything just works very, very easily without having all the extra layer of muck in the middle. So that's the execute internal. And then finally, by default, hey, payment voided is false, and you just exit the plugin. So this would be an example of how to use that action plugin example. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. So that was a whole lot of things very, very fast. And hopefully that made a lot of sense. So now is a great time if you have questions or things you want to dive into, questions for me, please put that in the chat. If you want to reach out to me, you can reach out to me on either Twitter, Labar, LinkedIn, Daryl Labar. If you do hit me up on LinkedIn, please make sure that you actually go through and give a note. Hey, I saw you at DynamicsCon in your session. That way, in 5 years, when you ask a question, which has happened many times, somebody that I saw at a conference once and I didn't have any information about where they were or where they came from or how they were there, and be like, oh, who is this person? Where do they come from? What's our context? If you add a note in your message to me in your LinkedIn request, then I can know, oh yeah, this person was to DynamicsCon 5 years ago. That's why they're familiar. That's why that's how I know them. So just add a note, hey, saw you here, and I'd be more than happy to include you as a friend request. If you don't add a note, you'll hit a long message from me saying, hey, how do I know you? I want to know who you are, sort of thing. I want to know how you know me. So yeah, so just a quick note on that. You can also check me out on YouTube. I don't do as much there anymore, although I do a lot of stuff on the XRM Toolcast. So if you're interested in tools, highly recommend that. And then all the code that I showed today can be found in my GitHub profile, primarily under the one that I mentioned for the example plugin test. So recommend that as well. Yeah, if there are any questions, I'd really like to appreciate DynamicsCon for inviting me on, for allowing me to get in. This is my first session going in, and hopefully it is something that you all found beneficial. And I'll talk to you real soon here, I guess. How's everyone doing? Hopefully you're doing well. Hopefully you've had some questions. Dinesh, awesome session. You like that one, Dinesh? Good. Glad you did. Real quick, let me get a quick feedback from the audience. If I can get the number of devs that we have in the audience, maybe give a 1 if you're a dev and a 2 if maybe you're already using a plugin, and maybe a 1 if you've never used a plugin-based class like that. Just kind of get an idea of where everyone sits on that. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask those. There was one during the session that I thought was a really good one that I wanted to call out here. That was by Larry here. But he said, shouldn't the plugin base throw a invalid plugin execution exception? So if you read anything on the Microsoft docs about exceptions and plugins, they all say to catch all your exceptions and throw them as an invalid plugin execution exception. The reason that I believe they do this is because if there's any custom exceptions, those will throw a serialization error, since if it's not included in the SDK, it's not included in the .NET Framework, it's a custom exception, it won't get serialized because it requires the ability to actually visit and access data using reflection, private data, in order to serialize that exception. So I think that's why they did that invalid plugin execution exception, was to try to catch that. Now, if you're throwing an exception within your plugin, sure, I'd throw that. In the base plugin, I don't worry about it because I have that extra logic that goes and checks to see, hey, is this plugin a valid plugin to throw? And then I throw it if I can. If I can, I rewrap it. The other important thing to note is, even if you get an exception, let's say you create your own exception that's like contact not found, and you create this own custom contact not found exception. If you create a new exception of type invalid plugin execution exception, and you catch the exception and you add that custom exception as a inner exception, that will still blow child, will still break when you attempt to log it. So just return whenever it gets thrown. So that's why I believe they say to use the invalid plugin execution exception. I don't ever worry about throwing that in the base class because I'm checking to see, hey, is this a valid exception to be thrown? If it is, I throw it. If not, then I actually wrap it in something that I can throw. So that was a good question there as well. I also had a few questions about where you can access the code base for this. So probably the best example is the XRM unit test.example in GitHub that has a couple example plugins, unit testing with it, all that kind of fun stuff wrapped up. So that's good there. But if you want to actually utilize this in your project, please use the Visual Studio Solution Accelerator in the XRM toolbox, and that will suck in this example project and basically put it in your project where it needs to be. It can add the unit testing for you, and it will also add in the appropriate classes at the appropriate places, so that way you can make sure you don't have to use IL merge to use any of this goodness. But feel free, if you already have your own plugin base and everything else, and you just want to grab a little section, grab a little section. Not going to hurt me one bit to have that grabbed. It's licensed for anybody to use for any purposes. Yeah. Another thing that I forgot to mention that I was thinking of as I was watching the presentation here is the get pre entity and get post entity. I don't know how many times in my life I have gone and tried to go get the pre entity or go get the post entity, and I pass in the name, pre-image, post-image, whatever, and I had a capitalization error between what it was registered versus what I typed in code, or I just completely different word. Maybe somebody else registered the image and I didn't know what it was, and so I get an error that image isn't in the collection. When I can't think of a single reason that you would ever have more than one pre-image or more than one post-image registered for a plugin. Therefore, my method get pre-entity and get post-entity just goes and grabs the very first pre-image or post-image in the collection rather than having to try to find it by name. That way, you don't care what it's named. You just go and grab it. So that really kind of makes life a little bit easier, and you don't have to worry about all those other issues that you could run into, just simple naming issues, capitalization issues, on things of that sort. So, yeah. So if you have any questions, feel free to post that. If you have a favorite feature, I'd love to hear that as well. Hey, what part was did you think about doing or you found most interesting? That'd be great to just get a quick chat here, because I've got nothing else to show you or talk about besides what you guys are going to say. So I'll give a few seconds to give you guys a break to think about that. And if we're not already connected on LinkedIn, feel free to send me an invite. Just make sure that you mention, hey, I watched your session here at DynamicsCon. If you say that, I will not turn down your request, even if you happen to have like an axe merit or something or other. I'll probably still accept it, just because if you're watching this stuff, you're probably somebody I really would like to get connected to. So, yeah, I did see. Oh, here's a question from Nish. Never thought about grabbing it via an image index. We'll try. Yeah, yep. Yeah, just rather than grabbing it by the name of it, you can just say, hey, give me the first item in the collection and be done with it. So really, really amazingly simple, and it feels really good to use it. It's just like, why didn't I think of that before? So I remember Andrew Patenko gave the same presentation back in a UGG seminar, and he was in there. He's like, I never thought of that. He's like, oh, it's awesome. So here's a comment from the team. Source-only NuGets are a little advanced for most devs. Maybe the dependent assemblies will somehow solve some of the problems. I think you're referring to what you showed me in your video, Batim, with that. No, you're thinking of the new feature that they have announced, but they haven't really rolled out yet, I believe, where we will be able to somehow include dependent assemblies. And that'll be great. If we get to that point, great. We can throw away these source-only NuGet packages or source-only code base because it's a little bit more expensive to compile because now you're compiling the same code for every single project. But it's real nice now where we don't have to worry about IL merging. Question from Dominic. Not directly related to your presentation, but is there anything in the Wave 2 that I believe released last Thursday that is worth checking out? I have no idea what was actually announced versus what was actually released, and all that kind of fun stuff. So feel free to comment if anybody has anything that you would think would be worth mentioning in that Wave 2 release as being helpful or useful or interesting, I guess. So I know Batim did share, he has some extensions as well. So those Albanian XRM extensions. So you can go ahead and feel free to check those out as well. I think we had a lot of the same similar type of things that we're doing, maybe a little more biased one way or the other. But yeah, it's always interesting as well because I do a lot of work in the context itself. There's no reason that you don't actually create your own plugin that is like the context of itself. That's an individual plugin instance per thread or per call. So that's another way you could go about doing it, but that just seems like another layer I don't really want to add to my projects. So yeah. All right. Larry, hopefully I answered your question. If I didn't answer that earlier, please feel free to let me know. One thing that I really wish we'd have a little more freedom with when it comes to plugin bases is the plugin trace not being limited to 2,000 characters. It'd be really nice if it was longer than that. So question from Andrea. For debugging plugins, attached to process doesn't always work for me, and that's the whole having the plugin registration tool and saying, hey, I want to debug this process, and you attach it to the process. Kind of amazing that it all works, but kind of a really weird, gimmicky way it feels like to be able to debug. Is there a sure way to step through the code? So I will say that over the last 8 years, I think I've used the debug feature of the plugin registration tool 3 times, maybe 2 or 3 times. And the reason for that is when you have a unit test and you get an error that you want to debug, as long as your plugin base actually spits out your pre-context information, it's very easy to take that and create a new test that contains that pre-context information. So what are the values in the target? What was the pre-image or what was the post-image or whatever happens to be in that plugin. It's really easy to go through and recreate your own test because you want to create a test anyway. If you've got a bug, if you've got something that's broken, it makes sense. Hey, I'm going to create a test that actually shows, hey, this is a bug, and then I'm going to write code to verify that I fixed the test. So for me, I don't spend, 3 times. Pretty literal, probably 3 times in the last 8 years that I've actually attempted to debug a plugin using the plugin registration tool. I'm always using unit tests to go through and do that. And yeah, whether you're using fake XRM easy, whether you're using XRM unit test, I don't care. There's really not that big of a difference between those two frameworks, but it makes it very easy. Both those frameworks make it very easy to set up your tests and be able to debug and step through your plugin each line and locally and not have to worry about any sort of issues with that. And then when you're done with it, now you've got a test going forward of, hey, this bug bit us. Make sure it doesn't happen again. which is always kind of egg on the face if you you have a bug, you somehow do something, recause the same bug to happen again after you fix it. No one really wants that to happen. So yeah. But no, good question. I that's how I handle it. And as far as being able to a surefire way for it to work, I don't have necessarily a surefire way for it to work because I don't usually use it a whole lot. Find the plugins to be way more efficient. Yep. But team, did you know if that new feature is supposed to be in this wave too? I hadn't heard an actual release date on that. If you do, feel free to put that in the chat. So. If you are a programmer person in the platform and you can't get enough of the stuff, highly recommend checking out my XRM unit test, my XRM Toolcast. There we go. Let's remember it. Podcast. Okay, it was supposed to be released in September. So whether they've released it in September, we don't know because we're still in September. But okay, all right. Yeah, that'll be an amazing new world when we actually get the ability to go through and add references to DLLs that we don't have to IL merge together. So we got, let's see, January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August. Okay, so we got 8 more days until the end of the month. So they got 8 more days. They got a whole week to hopefully get that in. And whether they get it in and tell us about it, I'm not sure, but hopefully that's the case. So I also want to make sure everyone understood all that work involved with the custom activities and just being able to access the request.this, response.that, and being able to update the values directly is way easier than kind of what you have to normally do and manage all that stuff. Way less code reuse. Okay, and looks like when that gets done, we have to update the plugin registration tool for the XM Toolbox afterwards too. Okay, that would make sense. I'm not even sure how they are even allowing the plugin base yet, as far as the plugin base, allowing the dependent DLLs as well in that. So will be interesting when that comes out. Looking forward to that immensely. Probably one of the biggest changes that's available for plugins for being able to access other code and other assemblies since 2011, probably 2011. Yep. So. All right, I've got 2 minutes. If there's any other comments or any other questions, feel free to speak now or forever hold your peace. And everything that I demoed today, all the code that I went through, I've used in every single project that I've been on. So just reuse it, add additional changes and features. I did get bit this week, not realizing that formatted values don't come in a target. Because my coalesce, I was like, hey, I need to add the formatted values when I coalesce. And the target doesn't contain formatted values by default. So that was kind of something I missed. They will be in the pre-entity or the post-image images, but the formatted values of an entity will not be in the target. Because it requires another database call. So I guess I probably need to create some sort of method to going and retrieving the option set text values. It's pretty common as well. But all right, last second for any questions. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for joining me. Hopefully you found it helpful and useful, and feel free to connect with me afterwards. So that's all for me.